I had never imagined that a simple visit to a store could change so much inside me. That morning, I decided to walk into one of the most famous luxury boutiques in the city. I wasn't wearing designer clothes, no heavy jewelry, no makeup carefully polished by professionals. I had just finished visiting a community project I supported on the outskirts, and I was dressed in the same simple jeans and a worn-out blouse. My hair was tied back, and my sneakers carried the dust of the streets I had just walked. When I stepped into the boutique, the air seemed to change. Perfume and silence hung in the space, broken only by the faint sound of classical music echoing softly through the polished floors. Crystal chandeliers shone above me, and rows of expensive bags and dresses gleamed under perfect lights. But while the objects sparkled, the looks I received were sharp, cold, piercing. The first saleswoman I approached didn't even let me finish my sentence. I asked, politely, to see a certain handbag I had noticed in the display. She didn't look me in the eyes. She simply glanced at my clothes, then at my sneakers, and smirked. "That one is very expensive," she said, her tone almost like a warning. I felt the weight of her judgment pressing against me. I smiled, still calm, and asked again if she could show me the bag. Instead of moving, she folded her arms and whispered something to another employee. They both laughed quietly, thinking I couldn't hear. The humiliation grew worse with every step I took. Every time I reached out toward a piece, one of them would follow me closely, not to assist, but to make sure I didn't damage anything. A couple walked in moments later, dressed in designer brands from head to toe, and immediately the staff rushed to greet them with champagne and smiles. Meanwhile, I was treated as though I had walked in by mistake, as though my presence itself polluted the perfection of their store. The breaking point came when I tried to ask for assistance again, this time from the manager himself. He approached with a tight smile, but his eyes revealed nothing but disdain. "Madam," he said, his voice heavy with irony, "I think perhaps this is not the right place for you. Our products are extremely exclusive. Maybe you'd feel more comfortable in one of the shops down the street." The words cut deep. For a moment, I froze. My throat burned, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I would still like to see the handbag," I replied, steady. His expression hardened, and he gestured toward the door. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We don't allow people to loiter here." Gasps came from other customers. I felt my face flush, not from shame, but from the sting of injustice. Slowly, I turned toward the exit. The staff looked satisfied, convinced they had rid themselves of an undesirable presence. But what they didn't know, what the arrogant manager had no idea about, was who I truly was. The truth would come crashing down on him in just a few minutes. And when it did, the walls of that boutique would never feel as safe and untouchable to him again. I walked out of that boutique with my head held high, though my chest felt heavy with the weight of humiliation. The air outside was fresher than the suffocating perfume of that place, but my heart pounded with a mixture of anger and sorrow. I wasn't angry that they had judged me by my clothes. I was furious that they treated every person who looked ordinary as if they were worthless. For a moment, I considered leaving quietly, forgetting the whole ordeal. But then I remembered my purpose for being there. I wasn't just any customer wandering in. That store, that entire boutique, was under my company's investment portfolio. Months earlier, I had purchased a majority stake in the luxury brand, though the deal had been made discreetly, without much public announcement. The staff, including that arrogant manager, had no idea who I was. I decided not to reveal it immediately. Instead, I crossed the street and entered a small cafe. From there, I watched the boutique through the glass as I sipped my coffee. My mind raced. Should I let the humiliation slide, or should I use this moment to make a point that would echo through every corner of that store? By the time I finished my cup, my decision was clear. I pulled out my phone and made a call. Within minutes, my assistant arrived, carrying a leather folder filled with documents. She knew the look in my eyes. I wasn't going to let this insult pass unanswered. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. I nodded. Together, we walked back into the boutique. The atmosphere was the same, polished, cold, distant. But this time, I wasn't there as the poor woman they had mocked. I was there as their silent owner, the woman whose signature carried the fate of their jobs. The same saleswoman spotted me first, her face twisted with annoyance. "Didn't we ask you to leave?" she said sharply. Before I could answer, The manager stepped forward, his false smile painted across his lips. "Madam, I thought I made myself clear. You are not welcome here." I let the silence hang for a few seconds, the weight of it pressing into the marble floor. Then, slowly, I handed him the folder. He frowned, confused, and opened it. Inside was a copy of the acquisition documents, official proof that I was not just a customer, but the majority shareholder of the brand he so proudly represented. His eyes widened, his smug expression collapsing into shock. He stammered, his face pale. This can't be real." "Oh, it's very real," I said, my voice calm but firm. "And it seems you have forgotten what this brand is supposed to stand for. Luxury without dignity is just arrogance dressed in silk. Today, you humiliated me because I didn't fit your idea of a worthy client. But the truth is, I am not only your client, I am your employer." Gasps echoed through the boutique. The couple who had been sipping champagne moments earlier turned their heads, astonished. The saleswoman's smirk had vanished, replaced by fear. And the manager, he looked as though the ground had opened beneath him. I didn't know," he stuttered. "That's the problem," I replied sharply. "You never cared to know. You judged me by my clothes, by my shoes, by my appearance. How many others have you treated this way? How many real clients have you driven away because you couldn't see past the surface?" The silence in the room was deafening. My words echoed against the glass displays and golden racks, louder than the music that now seemed to fade into nothing. I turned to the staff. "From this day forward, things will change. This boutique, and every boutique in this chain, will be retrained to understand what true service means. Every person who walks through these doors deserves respect, regardless of their clothes, their accent, or their wallet. And as for you," I looked directly at the manager, "you no longer represent this brand." His face drained of all color. He tried to protest, but my assistant had already handed him an envelope, his termination letter. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was finished. The saleswomen stood frozen, their eyes darting nervously, unsure whether they too would be dismissed. I softened my tone, but kept it firm. "You all have a choice. You can stay, and learn what real luxury is: respect, kindness, dignity, or you can leave. But know this, never again will Aurora," I paused, calling the brand by its true name, "be a place that humiliates people for looking ordinary. Because true luxury isn't the price tag, it's how you make people feel." At that, I walked to the display, picked up the handbag I had asked for earlier, and placed my credit card on the counter. The cashier's hands trembled as she completed the transaction. When she handed me the bag, her eyes were filled not with arrogance, but with humility. As I stepped out of the boutique, the entire staff stood in silence, the reality of who I was sinking into their bones. The city lights reflected on the glass doors behind me, and for the first time that day, I felt not humiliation, but power, the kind of power that comes not from money or titles, but from standing up against arrogance with dignity. And deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. When I stepped out of that boutique, handbag in hand, the city air felt different, lighter. I had entered those doors as a woman judged and dismissed, but I left as a force they could no longer ignore. Yet as empowering as that moment was, I knew the battle had only just begun. The following morning, the story exploded across the city. Someone inside the store, perhaps a customer, perhaps even one of the trembling saleswomen, had recorded the confrontation. The video spread like fire through social media. "Woman humiliated in luxury store revealed to be the secret owner." My face, my words, my defiance, it was everywhere. News outlets replayed the footage, influencers debated it, and the public reacted with fury at the arrogance of the boutique. Messages flooded my inbox. Some praised me as a hero, while others accused me of staging the entire scene for attention. "She planned it," skeptics sneered. "No one just walks into their own store dressed like that unless they want drama." But those who had been treated with the same disdain in places like that knew the truth. They wrote to me, thousands of them, sharing stories of humiliation, of being judged unworthy because of how they looked. Each letter, each confession, broke something inside me and built something else stronger in its place. I realized then that this wasn't only about me, it was about all of them. 2 days later, I called an emergency board meeting with the executives of the luxury brand. They sat around a long, polished table, their suits impeccable, their faces carefully neutral. Some were uneasy, afraid of the backlash, afraid of how the scandal might sink us. Others were defensive, muttering about isolated incidents and public overreaction. When my turn came, I stood. I didn't need notes. I let my anger, my hurt, and my vision pour into the room. "You call this an isolated incident?" I said, my voice firm. "It's not isolated, it's systemic. This brand has become so obsessed with exclusivity that it has forgotten humanity. If we don't change, we will die not from lack of wealth, but from lack of soul." One of the older executives, his tie perfectly knotted, scoffed. "With all due respect, madam, this brand thrives on being untouchable. People don't come here for kindness. They come for status." I turned my gaze to him, unflinching. "And status without dignity is nothing. If you think we can survive by treating people as less than human, you are welcome to leave. But as long as I am here, things will change." The room fell silent. Some eyes lowered, others stared at me with grudging respect. I knew then that not everyone was on my side. There would be resistance, perhaps even betrayal, but I had planted the seed, and there was no going back. The first step was radical. I ordered a full retraining of staff worldwide. Every boutique, every manager, every employee would be required to undergo a program on respect, humility, and true hospitality. The announcement caused an uproar. Some scoffed, some resisted, and a few even resigned, unwilling to bend their pride. But others embraced it, and to my surprise, many customers began applauding the effort. Then came the real challenge: rebranding. For decades, our advertisements had shown icy models and golden halls, symbols of wealth out of reach for ordinary people. I changed everything. New campaigns were shot, not with celebrities, but with real people: teachers, nurses, artists, mothers, each holding our products not as trophies of wealth, but as companions of dignity. The slogan shifted from "for the few" to "for the worthy," and I made it clear: everyone is worthy. The backlash was immediate. Competitors mocked us. Critics called it the death of luxury. Some shareholders threatened to pull out. But then, something unexpected happened. Sales soared. Not because the rich abandoned us, but because the public, who had long admired us from afar, finally felt invited in. They wanted not only the product, but the story, the dignity it carried. Yet success brought new enemies. Other luxury houses began to see me as a threat. They whispered about me at galas, plotted against me in boardrooms. And within my own walls, I sensed the unease of certain executives, men who had thrived on exclusivity and arrogance, watching as I dismantled the empire they thought untouchable. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I returned to my penthouse to find an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in clean black ink: "You are destroying everything we built. Step aside, or we will remove you ourselves." There was no signature, no name. But the message was clear. The humiliation I had suffered in that boutique had grown into a war not just for a brand, but for an idea. As I stood by the window, the city lights flickering below, I felt no fear, only determination. They had tried to humiliate me once, but they had no idea who I truly was. And now, the world was about to see just how far I was willing to go to protect what I had started. This was no longer just about handbags, dresses, or stores. This was about dignity, and I was ready to fight for it, no matter the cost. The note in the envelope haunted me through the night. Its words weren't idle threats. I could feel the sharpness of intent behind them, as if the writer had already chosen a weapon and was waiting for the right moment to strike. I barely slept. My mind raced, not with fear, but with calculation. Who among them would dare? The next morning, I arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. The glass tower gleamed in the sunrise, pristine on the outside but already rotting with whispers within. In the boardroom, the executives gathered, their polished suits and rehearsed smiles covering unease. They all greeted me politely, but I saw it, the flicker in their eyes, the glances exchanged when they thought I wasn't watching. Somewhere among them, my enemy was sitting, pretending to be an ally. I began the meeting with calm authority. "We are entering a new chapter," I said. "Our rebranding is working. Sales are climbing, customers are responding, and the world is beginning to see us differently. But some of you," I let my gaze sweep the table, "seem to believe I am destroying what you built. If that is how you feel, speak now." Silence. No one dared. They all stared back at me, their faces masks of neutrality. But silence is often louder than words. Over the next weeks, small disruptions began to appear. Important documents went missing. Decisions I had signed off on were quietly delayed. In 2 boutiques abroad, retraining sessions were accidentally cancelled. A press article leaked, painting me as a reckless dreamer risking the stability of a global empire. None of this was coincidence. It was sabotage, orchestrated from inside. I doubled my guard. My assistant, loyal as ever, began tracking every irregularity. Slowly, a pattern emerged, and with it, a name. It was Henry. Henry had been with the brand for more than 20 years, one of the old guard, a man who had built his career on exclusivity. To him, luxury meant distance, superiority. He had never accepted my vision, though he'd never opposed me directly until now. I should have seen it earlier, the way his smile never reached his eyes, the way he always phrased his objections as concerns for stability. The confirmation came one evening when Rosa, the manager I had promoted to lead the first retraining program, called me in tears. "Madam," she whispered through the phone, "one of the executives threatened me today. He said if I continue supporting your changes, I'll lose my position. He said you won't be around much longer." My blood turned to fire. This was no longer about resistance to change. This was war. The next board meeting, I arrived with evidence. Documents traced back to Henry's office. Emails, subtle but damning, revealing his attempts to undermine me. When I placed them on the table, the room fell into shocked silence. Henry's face paled, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, smirked, and said, "Do you really think you can erase decades of tradition with your little speeches about dignity? This empire was built on power, not kindness. You may own the majority shares, but you don't own the soul of this brand. We do. People like me." I met his gaze, steady and cold. "No, Henry, you own the shadows. I own the light. And it only takes one flame to drive shadows away." Then I dismissed him. On the spot, his shouts echoed through the hall as security escorted him out, but his words clung to me. "You can't save them all. They'll turn on you. Just wait." I wanted to believe it was over, that cutting him out would end the rot. But in the days that followed, more cracks appeared. Henry had allies, others who feared losing their grip on the old ways. They moved quietly, spreading doubt among shareholders, feeding stories to the press. A narrative began to form: the new owner is unstable, emotional, unfit to lead. For the first time, the weight of it all pressed down on me. Alone in my office late at night, I stared at the city lights and wondered if Henry had been right. Could I really change an empire so vast, so steeped in arrogance? Or would I be swallowed by it? But just as despair threatened to take root, something happened that reignited my strength. A letter arrived, handwritten, from a young woman in Brazil. She had seen the viral video of my humiliation and revelation. She wrote, "I work 3 jobs to support my family. I never dreamed I could walk into a store like yours without being treated like dirt. But because of you, I tried. And when I did, they treated me like a queen. For the first time in my life, I felt worthy. Thank you." I held that letter in my hands for a long time, tears burning my eyes. That was it. That was why I fought. Not for the boardroom, not for profits, not even for the brand. For the people, for their dignity. So I rose again, stronger, determined. If Henry and his allies wanted war, I would give it to them. Not with the weapons they used: lies, sabotage, intimidation, but with the truth, with transparency, with the voices of the very people they had spent decades silencing. And I knew exactly where to begin: by taking the fight out of the shadows of the boardroom and into the light of the world stage. Because if they thought they could bury me quietly, they had forgotten one thing. I had already survived humiliation once, and I had turned it into power. This time, I would turn it into a revolution. The revolution didn't start with fire or fury. It started with a stage, a microphone, and a room filled with journalists from across the world. I called the press conference myself, bypassing the board's approval. They had wanted to keep the fight quiet, to smother me under whispers and rumors. I would not allow it. If they wanted shadows, I would drag everything into the light. When I stepped onto the stage, cameras flashed like lightning. The air was thick with anticipation. Reporters expected excuses, maybe even an announcement of my resignation. Instead, I gave them the truth. I inherited this company not only in name, but in responsibility, I said. And I discovered a rot inside it, the belief that wealth is worth more than dignity, that appearance decides value, that humanity can be priced like a handbag. That ends now, not in theory, not tomorrow. Today, I revealed everything: the sabotage, the humiliation I had suffered in one of my own boutiques, the way ordinary customers had been treated for decades. I did not spare names. Henry's betrayal was laid bare before the world, and though he was gone, the echo of his arrogance remained in the old guards still clinging to power. The room buzzed with questions, accusations, applause. By the time I stepped down from the stage, the story had already gone viral. The luxury revolution, some called it. Others branded me a dangerous idealist. But one thing was certain: the world was watching. The days that followed were chaos. Crowds formed outside our flagship stores, not to protest, but to enter. People who had never dared step inside before now walked in proudly, phones in hand, documenting their experience. Some cried as they tried on clothes they once thought forbidden to them. Others simply walked around, heads held high, as if reclaiming territory stolen from them long ago. But not everyone celebrated. Shareholders panicked. The old guard whispered of loss of exclusivity, brand dilution, financial suicide. They convened emergency meetings behind closed doors, speaking in hushed voices about stripping me of power. And then came the retaliation. Anonymous emails flooded journalists' inboxes, filled with fabricated scandals about me. They painted me as unstable, manipulative, unfit to run a global empire. Some tabloids devoured the lies eagerly. Protesters, paid, I suspected, appeared outside the tower with signs calling me a fraud. Online, hashtags trend against me, orchestrated by unseen hands. The pressure was relentless. At night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of a billion-dollar empire pressing down on my chest. Doubt whispered in the darkness: what if they are right? What if this was too much, too fast? But then, the letters began to arrive. Thousands of them, handwritten, emailed, recorded as videos. From women, men, children, workers, dreamers, people from villages, towns, and cities across the world. A factory worker from India wrote, "For years I stitched clothes I could never afford. Today, I walked into your store. For the first time, I felt the worth of my own hands." A young man from South Africa said, "I used to pass your boutique every day, ashamed of my shoes. Yesterday, I stepped inside. No one sneered, no one judged. I cried, madam, I cried." Those voices drowned out the doubt. They were my shield, my sword, my proof. But the war was far from over. One night, as I worked late in my office, the phone rang. A voice, distorted and cold, said only one sentence before the line cut: "You won't survive the next shareholders meeting." I knew what that meant. They weren't just trying to strip me of power. They were ready to destroy me completely, financially, reputation, ally, maybe even physically. So I prepared. I reached out to allies in silence: loyal managers, brave employees, even customers whose voices had power in the digital world. I gathered them like an army, not of weapons, but of truth and presence. The day of the shareholders' meeting arrived. The hall was grand, glittering with chandeliers, but the tension in the air was sharper than broken glass. Executives sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable. Shareholders whispered in corners, glancing at me as if I were already defeated. Henry wasn't there, but his influence lingered in the eyes of those who still believed in his creed. They were ready to vote, to take everything from me, but they didn't know what I had prepared. When I took the stage, it wasn't just me. Behind me, the massive screens lit up with faces: not celebrities, not politicians, but ordinary people. Customers, workers, tailors, cashiers, delivery drivers, from every continent. Each one shared a message, short, raw, powerful. Stories of how the brand had changed since my reforms, how dignity had finally walked through doors once locked by arrogance. The room shifted, whispers died. Even the most cynical faces faltered as testimony after testimony poured out, a flood of truth no smear campaign could drown. I ended with only 3 words: "This is luxury." The vote still came. They tried to strip me, but the tide had turned. Enough shareholders saw what I had unleashed: not destruction, but rebirth. The majority sided with me, narrowly, painfully, but enough. I walked out of that hall knowing one thing: the war wasn't won, but I had survived the storm. And survival was victory, because it meant I could keep fighting. As I stepped into the night, flashes of cameras greeted me, questions flying, chaos swirling. Yet in the middle of it all, I felt strangely calm, because I understood now this wasn't just about me, or about a brand. This was a battle for the soul of an empire, and I wasn't finished yet. Not even close. The night after the shareholders' meeting should have been a victory. My name trended worldwide, messages of support poured in, and for the first time, I felt the empire bending, not breaking, but bending toward a new future. But victory, I learned, has a price. 2 nights later, I left the headquarters long after midnight. The streets were quiet, the city asleep. My driver pulled up to the curb, but before I could open the car door, I noticed something odd. The usual security team stationed outside was gone. No guards, no familiar presence, just shadows. And then I saw it. A figure leaning against the corner, watching me, his face hidden, but his eyes glowed cold under the streetlight. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. I froze. My instincts screamed. Without a word, I turned and walked back inside the building. By the time reinforcements arrived, the man had vanished. That was the first warning. The second came in the form of a package delivered to my private office the next morning. No return address. Inside, a velvet box, lined with silk. At first glance, it seemed harmless, beautiful, even. But when I lifted the lid, my stomach turned. A dead bird lay inside, its wings clipped, its feathers blackened with soot, and a note beneath it: "This is what happens to things that try to fly too high." I burned the note, but the message seared into my mind. This was no longer a battle of words and shareholders. Someone wanted me broken, perhaps destroyed. Still, I refused to yield. Instead, I doubled my campaign. Stores expanded their doors to communities that had never dared approach them. Entire villages tuned into live streams where tailors, seamstresses, and designers shared their stories. I was transforming not only the brand but the very definition of luxury, and that terrified them. Because with every person who felt empowered, every customer who stepped proudly into a boutique, I stole power from those who had built their empire on fear, exclusion, and arrogance. It was only a matter of time before they struck harder. One evening, Rosa called me, her voice shaking. "Madam, you need to come, now." She sent me an address, not one of our stores, but an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Against every instinct, I went. I couldn't risk ignoring her. The place was dark, the air damp with rust and old secrets. I entered cautiously, the sound of my heels echoing in the emptiness. And there she was, Rosa, tied to a chair, her face bruised, her eyes wide with terror. Before I could move, shadows stepped out from behind the pillars. Men in tailored suits, but their smiles carried no civility. "Madam," one of them said, his voice smooth as poison, "you've made quite the mess of things. All this equality, all this dignity. You're destabilizing a system older than you realize." My blood ran cold. "Who sent you?" He chuckled. "Names don't matter. What matters is this: you can either step down quietly, or we bury you and everything you love with the rubble of your revolution." My hands trembled, but my voice did not. "Do you think fear will silence me? I was humiliated in front of the entire world and turned it into fire. You think shadows scare me now?" Something flickered in his eyes: anger, maybe even respect. He leaned closer. "Careful, madam. Flames burn bright, but they also burn out fast." They released Rosa unharmed, but the message was clear: this wasn't just business rivalry, it was conspiracy, organized and deep. From that night on, my world changed. Every phone call, I wondered if it was tapped. Every car that followed me, I wondered if it was theirs. Friends began to distance themselves, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. But then came the revelation that turned everything upside down. A former executive, disillusioned and afraid, reached out to me in secret. He brought files, old contracts, offshore accounts, hidden agreements. And among them, I saw something that made my blood freeze. These men, this so-called council of the old guard, weren't just fighting me. They had been laundering money through the brand for years, building a secret empire beneath the velvet surface of luxury. My reforms threatened not only their power, but their survival. And at the center of it all, was a name I thought I'd buried with Henry. He wasn't just a bitter executive. He was the bridge between the boardroom and this secret empire. Even in exile, he was pulling strings, whispering in the ears of dangerous men who valued blood over balance sheets. I realized then, this was no longer about fashion, dignity, or even reputation. This was war against an empire of shadows. And I had two choices: yield and vanish quietly, or fight with everything I had, even if it cost me everything. So I chose. I looked at the city skyline that night, its towers glittering like knives in the darkness, and I whispered to myself, they wanted a queen. They'll get a warrior. War, I realized, wasn't fought only in boardrooms or courtrooms. It was fought in whispers, in shadows, in the spaces where truth and lies collided. And if I was to survive this empire of corruption, I had to widen the battlefield beyond anything they imagined. The files the disillusioned executive gave me were dynamite. They revealed layers of rot so deep it made my skin crawl. Offshore accounts tied to shell companies, properties purchased under false names, networks that stretched from Hong Kong to Dubai, London to São Paulo. The brand I thought I owned outright was not only a fashion house, it had become a vessel for laundering billions. If my reforms succeeded, if I opened every door, tore down every wall, the light would pour in. And light, to these men, was death. So I lit the match. I contacted investigative journalists, the ones feared and respected for never bowing to pressure. I leaked just enough information to spark questions, to stir the waters. And as the first exposes hit the headlines, I felt the tremors shake the empire's foundation. But tremors are dangerous. They wake giants. The retaliation was swift and brutal. My accounts were hacked. Personal photos manipulated and released to tabloids with vile stories attached. Unstable widow, one cover called me. Destroyer of legacy. Protesters, paid by unseen hands, flooded our flagship stores in Paris and New York, chanting against me. Then came the night of fire. At 3 a.m, alarms blared. One of our oldest boutiques, a Parisian landmark, was in flames. Firefighters fought 4 hours, but by dawn, the building was a charred skeleton. Investigators ruled it arson almost immediately. And in the ashes, scrawled crudely on a wall, were 3 words: "Step down now." I stood before the ruins with cameras flashing around me, the smell of smoke thick in my lungs. For a moment, grief nearly broke me. This was more than stone and fabric, it was memory, heritage. But then I thought of the letters, the faces on the screens, the voices of people who had felt dignity for the first time. I clenched my fists and swore, "You burn our walls, but you will never burn our spirit." That declaration, broadcast live, went viral. The world divided more sharply. Some called me reckless, insane for provoking such powerful enemies. Others hailed me as a warrior, a symbol that luxury could no longer be caged by arrogance and corruption. And then, the unexpected happened. Allies began to rise. In Milan, a group of young designers, once shunned by the old guard, offered their talents to my cause. In Tokyo, loyal customers formed networks online, documenting how our stores had changed. In Lagos, a seamstress collective staged a fashion show using our brand's fabrics, dedicating it to me. "Luxury is dignity," they shouted as cameras rolled. Each spark caught fire across continents, building a movement. What had begun as my personal battle was no longer mine alone. It was becoming global. The council panicked. They unleashed their final weapon, fear through silence. Rosa disappeared one night. Her phone went dead, her apartment empty. Days later, a package arrived at my office. Inside was her scarf, stained with something dark. The message was clear: "We can reach anyone." I broke that day. Behind closed doors, I sobbed like a child, fear clawing at my chest. Rosa wasn't just an employee, she was my ally, my friend. Guilt crushed me. Had my war put her life in danger? But then, another message arrived, this time encrypted, through an anonymous email. Only 3 words: "I'm still alive." Hope surged through me. Rosa had escaped, or been spared. Either way, she was out there. And if she was alive, then I couldn't falter. The next phase of the war was no longer about defense. It was time to strike back. I gathered my closest allies in a hidden location, far from the eyes of the council. Executives who had chosen loyalty over fear. journalists who refused bribes, even a handful of government officials who had been waiting for someone brave enough to challenge the corruption. Together, we built a strategy to expose the council fully, publicly, irrevocably, not with leaks, but with evidence so undeniable it would topple them in courts, in governments, in the eyes of the world. The risk was immense. If we failed, they wouldn't just take my company, they would erase me. But as I looked around the room at the faces of those willing to risk everything beside me, I realized something profound. This was no longer a fight to protect a brand. This was a war for truth itself. And truth, once unleashed, cannot be chained again. I rose from my chair, my voice steady, my heart burning. They wanted me humiliated, broken, erased. Instead, they made me unstoppable. They turned my cause into a movement. Now, we end this. Not for me, not for profit, but for every single person who was ever told they didn't belong. The room erupted in applause, in determination, in fire. The council thought they ruled from the shadows, but shadows only exist when there is light, and I was ready to blind them with it. The final war had begun. The movement had grown beyond me. What started with humiliation in a boutique now stretched across continents, a tide of voices rising against the rot that had hidden beneath velvet curtains for decades. The council thought they were untouchable, that power wrapped in silk and money could last forever. But now their empire was trembling, its walls cracking, their shadows shrinking as the light spread. The final strike had to be decisive. No leaks, no rumors, no half measures. We needed one undeniable blow that would shatter them publicly and forever. The disillusioned executive's files gave us breadcrumbs, but Rosa, my loyal friend, my ally, delivered the feast. After weeks in hiding, she reappeared one night in a safe house, her face thin, her spirit tired but unbroken. She carried a flash drive. On it were recordings, contracts, photographs, evidence that the council had been running their hidden empire for decades: money laundering, political bribes, even ties to organized crime. But the most damning piece was a recording. Henry's voice. Henry, my supposed adversary cast out months before, was never gone. He had been the council's envoy all along. And in that recording, his arrogance betrayed him. She thinks this is about fashion. Foolish woman, this brand has been our kingdom, our bank, our weapon. We decide who matters in this world. If she tears it open, we bury her, and anyone with her. It was the smoking gun. We prepared for the Global Shareholders Summit, an event streamed live, attended by world press, watched by millions. The council planned to use it to strip me of my last power, to brand me unfit, to erase me in front of the world. Instead, I would use it to destroy them. The day arrived. The hall was a cathedral of glass and steel, glittering with false grandeur. Cameras flashed as I entered, whispers trailing me like knives. The council members sat together, smug and certain of victory, their eyes gleaming like predators. Henry was there too, returned from exile, smirking as if the game was already won. They began their attack with venom-coated words, that I had destabilized profits, endangered tradition, risked the brand's reputation. They painted me as naive, dangerous, a woman out of control. Applause followed their speeches, carefully orchestrated by their allies in the room. And then it was my turn. I walked slowly to the podium, my heels echoing like drums of war. My hands trembled, but my voice did not. You call me naive, you call me reckless, but I am not the one who sold this brand's soul to shadows. You are. Gasps rippled through the hall. Henry laughed, shaking his head, waving dismissively at me as if I were a child. Do you have proof, widow? Or only pretty speeches? That was when the screens behind me lit up. One by one, the evidence appeared: contracts signed with false names, offshore transfers, bank accounts in tax havens. And finally, the recording. Henry's voice echoed through the chamber, dripping with arrogance, damning every last one of them. The room erupted in chaos. Reporters screamed questions. Shareholders stood, shouting. Some council members tried to deny, others sat frozen, pale as ghosts. Henry's smirk vanished, replaced by fury. He lunged from his chair, pointing at me, shouting curses, but his words were drowned by the storm of outrage. Security moved in, not for me, but for them. Governments had been waiting for this. Within hours, investigations launched across borders, warrants were issued, accounts frozen, allies fled. The empire of shadows collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. And Henry, once the architect of my humiliation, once the smirking king of the old order, was dragged away, his eyes burning into mine. "You think you've won," he spat. "But power always returns to the shadows." I met his gaze without fear. "No, Henry, not this time. The world is watching now. And shadows cannot survive the light." When it was over, the hall was silent. I stood alone at the podium, the wreckage of an empire around me. And then, from the back of the room, applause began. Slow, steady, growing louder as journalists, shareholders, and even employees rose to their feet. It wasn't applause for profit, or power, or tradition. It was for dignity. For the first time, luxury meant humanity. In the months that followed, the brand transformed completely. No more velvet ropes, no more sneers at the door. Boutiques opened training centers for young designers from poor neighborhoods. Factories received funding for workers' welfare. A scholarship program carried the name of the woman who had believed in me first, my mother. The world called it the luxury revolution. To me, it was something simpler: justice. I often thought back to the moment it all began, that humiliation in the boutique, the sneer of a manager who thought I was less because of how I looked. That single wound had set fire to an empire. And as I stood years later, watching children of tailors walk proudly into schools wearing uniforms we funded, I realized something profound. Sometimes, humiliation is not the end, it is the spark. And from that spark, if you refuse to bow, you can set the world alight.